I think she's speaking, but we don't hear anything.
Yes, does it work that we should be hearing from the Berlin room directly?
Yeah, but we don't hear people in the room.
Indeed.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. I know it's okay. Sorry, one second. I don't know how to. I hope that this. Okay. So this is the event Value-Based and Human Rights Approach to Address Climate Adaptation Issues for a Just GST Delivery. We will run the side events in two different roundtables. The first one will be oriented to the more the sectorial and rights to the justice and the youth participation in the GST and the adaptation aspects, and the second one will go on the democracy of the deliberative democracy, the GST transition, and the how we shift from solution to resolution in adaptation. So. I'm really sorry because I need to take out this. The technology is not always my stuff. Can I help you? Yes, thank you. You can just thank you very much. And okay, I'm Floridea di Ciommo from cambiaMO. This is a co-organized event among different organizations. cambiaMO, that is an NGO based in Madrid, and I co-chair the event here in presence and with Audrey, who is online and is I will leave the floor to Audrey. She is the digital organizer for EarthRights International, building solidarity and power amongst frontline communities, activists, supporters, and human rights defender at the global level. So, Audrey, I leave you the floor just to present how we will run the session. We have this hybrid session, so we're sorry for this some technical problem that we can have. Like you have seen that I'm not able to just to take out the microphone on my phone, but let's go ahead. And the session is really related to the, I said, what we would like to, in the open remarks, what we would like to say after this 26th section of the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow. The first global stocktake was launched with the goal of taking stock of the implementation of the Paris Agreement and assessing the collective progress towards achieving the purpose and long-term goals of the agreement. The GST is undertaken in a comprehensive facilitative manner. Even in this SB 58, we had the possibility to have the World Cafe, where we had quite a good participation, and as well the round table. What we would like to point out through these side events is that we need to operationalize the human rights. We know that there is a kind of human rights in the preamble of Paris, but what our objective is to make them operational in the participation, in the right of participation, right of communication, and so on. So this first roundtable will be oriented to the public participation and stakeholder consultation, the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities should be emphasized more by parties, and it is important to consider in the adaptation planning and implementation. And some parties highlighted, but still we need to highlight it more, the inclusive measures that leave no one behind and benefit the most vulnerable and most impacted people, such as youth, children, women and girls in all their diversity, elderly, indigenous peoples, persons with disability, persons with chronic disease, environmental migrants, low-income persons, and people in rural and remote communities. So we adopt this human rights approach, value-based. Our objective is here in the UNFCCC, but as well in other arenas where we are working in climate assemblies, for example, at the European level, for shifting from experts' view to a value-based and human rights perspective view, focusing on people in situation of vulnerability, and to advocate for the GST and equity aspects more strongly in the GST negotiation. So with that, I leave the floor to Hailey Campbell. She is a youth activist, born, I really like your way to define yourself, born in, we can say, climate, not into a community of climate deniers, who holds a Master of Sustainability solution, and now she is Executive Director of Care About Climate. She empowers young people to be their own best advocates in climate decision-making space through education, training, and access. So I will give you the floor, and we would like to know from you, Hailey, a little bit what role do young people play in delivering a value-based and human rights approach to the GST from the perspective of a climate adaptation strategy, and how should young people be included in this process, if they are already enough, not enough, and so on. So the floor is yours.
All right, cool. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction and also for having me here with all of you today. It is really exciting to be able to share about the connections between young people and intergenerational justice, as well as adaptation efforts that I hope all are going to be informing the global stocktake and things that we are hearing even right now. I know that the adaptation roundtables are also going on, and so there are people in the room there that are also advocating for these types of priorities. And so to answer the first first question on the role of young people in the global stocktake and then threading that through to adaptation. Care About Climate has this really amazing NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution, equity tracker. And what we do with this tracker is we empower young people from their communities at home in their country to learn about their NDC and give them skills to be able to provide concrete recommendations to their governments for the enhancement of their inclusion, as well as the inclusion of women and any other topic that they deem interesting, whether it's Indigenous peoples inclusion, civil society inclusion, or adaptation. And through this equity tracker, we've seen that young people are often not included in our nationally determined contributions, and that's really significant because we are the people that are inheriting this earth, these jobs. We're the people that will hopefully be alive in 2050, right? These are things you've probably all already heard before. And so when we're thinking about the global stocktake, what we also want to see is an increase in ambition of the inclusion of young people, not just listed as vulnerable groups, but as contributors to the process, as implementers of the solutions as well. And so through this framework in this report that they're putting together, what we're seeing is not just, numbers or bullet points on a page. This is really a lifeline for a lot of people, a lot of vulnerable communities, not just young people, especially when it comes to adaptation, because right now we're seeing through climate disasters and issues that are happening all around the world, the first people to often lose their jobs are going to be young people who have less experience in these spaces. When we're trying to even find jobs or go for opportunities, if there's so many different disasters going on, we won't be able to focus on trying to find ways to contribute to a green future in this world, right? And so when we're thinking about adaptation, it's not just about disasters, it's also about these slow, longer onset events like sea level rise and heat. I live on the island of Oahu in the state of Hawaii in the United States. And on this island, we're already seeing houses falling into the ocean. We're seeing communities that have their cultural important traditions that are along the shorelines not being able to practice anymore because the ocean is coming up against their sacred areas. And we're seeing young people not getting to continue the traditions of surfing in their community because the wave patterns are changing due to coastal erosion and sea level rise. And so these are all things that we're observing and things that are really important to affecting our future and ability to continue traditions, but also continue ways of life. And so and connecting all of this together, I really am hopeful that in the global stocktake, these perspectives of young people are going to be listened to as people that will be responsible for our future and for hopefully creating a better future than how it was left for us. And so to your second question on how are young people being included? Are they being included enough? In my opinion, there will never be enough youth inclusion. There's always going to be more young people, more diverse perspectives that are coming to center stage, and we need to make sure that we're consistently including them. Having one person who's young on a delegation saying, I am the youth voice, is not the youth voice. It's that person should be reaching out, consulting with other young people in their communities, consulting and co-creating solutions that we want to see in our contributions to a climate just future. And so for young youth inclusion, it's been amazing to have opportunities to contribute to the global stocktake, especially in the roundtables and the world cafes. There's been a lot of amazing inclusion, and I hope to see that continuing as we move forward and turn into concrete actions where we're not just contributing to a report, we're actually implementing the outcomes of that report and being included and co-creating everything along the way. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah. And now I would like to present Alejandra Lozano, the GI-ESCR. She is Program Officer of Climate and Environmental Justice at the Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and where she leads the project on a just energy transition focused on mainstreaming human rights and gender perspective. Like we have seen in the summary report, we feel a lack of a gender perspective in the GST, and as well about the human rights, as well because there is a common understanding that the human rights is in the preamble of Paris Agreement, so not needs to decline the human rights and gender perspective in a more operative way. So I would like to ask you, Alejandra, why is it important to include a human rights based approach in the GST, and how could the outcomes of the GST contribute to drive a just energy transition that halts the climate emergency while realizing human rights. Just a couple of side events before this one, we had a very crowded side events by the UNFCCC on energy transition. Energy poverty is a key issue, was addressed yesterday during the mitigation roundtable from some parties. So we would just to know a little bit more about that, and I will leave to you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Floridea, for that wonderful presentation. And to try to tackle these two questions that are very much broad in scope, in this presentation I will try to make three main points. The first one is related to the relevance of the Just Transition Framework to deliver on a GST that can contribute to the effective implementation of the Paris Agreement. That will be a first idea that I will further unpack. A second idea in this line is the importance of not reducing the concept of just transition to a question related exclusively to mitigation and to energy related issues to the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies, but really as a key component of adaptation efforts. And finally, I would like to make a third point on the role that the international human rights framework can play in grounding these very ambitious agendas. So in relation to this main point, I would like first to emphasize that despite the many approaches advanced on the concept and objectives of a just transition and how a just transition should look like in practice, there is a common understanding that I think is key for this conversation, that this agenda is essentially about integrating principles of equity and social justice in all dimensions of climate action. In its most traditional conceptualization, as we probably all know, just transition is mainly focused on the transformation of the workforce in the fossil fuel industry. This framework was born out of the labor movement in the late 1960s that was concerned about the adverse impacts that the shift towards clean renewable energies will have on employment opportunities and on livelihoods. For these precise reasons, just transition has been understood as a pathway to achieve the decarbonization of the energy sector while protecting and realizing the rights of workers and communities. In its origins, it is a framework to advance mitigation measures responsive to social justice concerns. And in these respects, it is a framework to create the social support needed to meet with the Paris Agreement objectives to reduce emissions and limit global overwarming. However, and especially after participating and being able to listen to the recent discussions on the Just Transition Work Program that are being held here today in the Bonn Climate Change Conference, it seems that there is a growing understanding that just transition should include, but also go beyond, labor concerns in the energy sector associated with mitigation efforts, and should really encompass broader transformations towards sustainability in other key sectors such as agriculture, transport, waste management, education, health, that must be also part of an ambition and agenda to build climate resilient societies. The Just Transition Framework in this context is critical to put at the center of adaptation measures the needs, interests, and voices of the most marginalized, including women, indigenous peoples, youth, and persons with disabilities, among many others. In this line, I would like to underscore the importance of understanding just transition processes as key components of adaptation processes. This involves, although not exclusively, to pay attention to the provision of universal access to sustainable energy and to harness efforts to combat energy poverty in all its dimensions. As we know, without access to clean, renewable, and affordable energy and clean cooking solutions, communities and workers alike cannot conduct processes of electrification and access to technology that are indispensable to face the risks posed by the climate change emergency. In short, the just transition concept, broadly understood, should be a critical component of the conversation on the global stocktaking, at least in relation to these two key pillars of the climate change regime concerning mitigation and adaptation, to ensure a fair and effective implementation of the Paris Agreement. My final point, just to not extend further, related to the role that human rights can play in pushing forward this ambitious agenda, is really, in my opinion, paramount. The human rights framework provides us with a wide range of rights, a catalog or a bill of rights that not only enshrine obligations that states and other stakeholders should comply with, but also provides common values, principles, and more specifically, priorities to ground this just transition work program that is being discussed in this climate change conference, and that it should build on and advance and contribute to the work so far achieved in mitigation and adaptation efforts. The catalogs of rights on, for instance, the right to work, the right to social security, education, health, adequate housing, food, as well as the rights to meaningful participation, provide policy tools that are indispensable to transition and to raise living standards in this transformative framework. These human rights-based views on just transitions should inform the outcomes of the global stocktaking process that should emphatically state that there cannot be a just transition pathway without fossil fuel phase-out and without access to reliable, affordable, renewable energy. In short, when we think about the Paris Agreement and the objectives that are established in this critical convention, when it states that the global average temperature should stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius and well below 2 degrees Celsius, it essentially underscores that we fundamentally and radically need to transform all of our social, political, and economic structures, local and internationally. And in that sense, we need nothing short of a paradigm shift in the way we produce and consume. This is a challenge without precedent, with a very small window of opportunity to undertake decisive action. So in that context, the way we frame solutions to address these challenges will have far-reaching consequences in the way we power, manage, and organize our future societies and economies. And I just wanted to underscore how important it is to ground these ideas of just transition in the processes that will inform and that will take precedence on the global stock-taking process. Thank you, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. Now I will give the floor to Audrey. She is the moderator of online room, and she will introduce our third speaker from Africa. And yeah, please, the floor is to you for the moderation and for introducing and manage the last speaker of this first roundtable. Thank you very much, Audrey.
Thank you, Floridea, and thank you, Alejandra and Hailey, for your remarks so far. It's my pleasure to introduce Tawonga Chihana from Natural Justice. Tawonga is the coordinator for the African Environmental Defenders Initiative at Natural Justice, where she leads interventions that aim to strengthen environmental defenders' rights and enhance the legal protection of environmental human rights defenders across Africa. She has worked extensively on the protection of community land rights in Southern Africa, supporting communities, civil society, national and international organizations in formulating program strategies that improve land tenure security and promote responsible land-based investments through customary land formalization, community-led advocacy, legal empowerment, capacity building, and corporate engagement. Tawonga, thank you for being here. I'm curious, why is it important to include the situation of environmental human rights defenders in the GST dialogue? And how does a human rights-based approach to climate change promote environmental rights and the work of environmental defenders? Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and hello to everyone. I'm happy to be here and to be attending this virtually. So to start off with answering your first question, I would first like to start off by briefly contextualizing the situation of environmental human rights defenders before I go into why it is important to include them in GST dialogue. According to the recent global analysis report that was published by Frontline Defenders, it was reported that land and environmental defenders were the most targeted sector in 2022 when compared to other sectors of human rights. And to add on to that, the HRD Memorial Report, also referenced in the same report I mentioned, recorded 401 targeted killings of human rights defenders in 2022, and 48% of those killings were environmental human rights defenders. So despite all the legal and policy groundwork made at both regional and global level, attacks against environmental human rights defenders continue to rise at an alarming and concerning rate. And this is why it is important to include the situation of environmental human rights defenders in the GST dialogue. Because as defenders, they not only bear the brunt of fossil fuel expansion, climate change impacts, and loss and damage, but will also potentially shoulder the negative human rights impacts of false solutions offered for climate change mitigation and adaptation. And we really cannot talk about climate adaptation without first acknowledging the work of environmental human rights defenders as frontline defenders of biodiversity, land, and the environment. So the GST should take into account what extent the states are failing to respect, promote, and consider the human rights of environmental defenders, as well as indigenous peoples and local communities, when taking action to address climate change as outlined in the Paris Agreement. The GST, I believe, is an opportunity for Paris commitments to turn into political action, and in so doing, GST technical dialogues and roundtables must examine the discrepancy between the existing legal frameworks and conventions and treaties and instruments that seek to protect environmental human rights defenders and the increasing violence against them, and offer specific and concrete guidelines on how states can guarantee protection for environmental human rights defenders as the people not only living on the front lines of the climate crisis, but the rights holders in all adaptation measures. And to move on to your second question, in terms of how does a human rights-based approach to climate change promote environmental rights and the work of environmental defenders, environmental human rights defenders are often excluded from national, regional, global policy dialogue on climate action. The lack of recognition for environmental human rights defenders in climate global processes, such as the UNFCCC, the ACE, the Glasgow Climate Pact, highlight this issue. Access to information and public participation are human rights that are key to achieving the objectives of the Paris Agreement. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has confirmed that to solve the climate crisis, climate action must be participatory and inclusive of people in vulnerable situations. And this would include indigenous peoples and local communities and environmental human rights defenders, which in turn would lead to cohesive, legitimate, and sustainable outcomes. So we're saying that a holistic human rights-based approach to climate change would consider how environmental human rights defenders' rights are persistently violated and how they are risking their lives in the fight against the climate crisis. And in effectively implementing a human rights-based approach to climate change would be lending greater support to environmental defenders, who are the people on the front line of the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and land grabs, and are advocating for climate justice, opposing climate damaging projects, and false solutions. So I'll end there for now. Thank you so much, Audrey.
Thank you very much, Tawonga. And now the floor is open to the audience for this first round of questions to the first three speakers that we had. Any question from the audience? Yes, please. Just we wait for the micro. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hello? Hello?
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Maria Anaya. I am a Colombian PhD student at Cornell University. And my questions are for Hailey and for Alejandra. Hailey, you mentioned intergenerational equity and also slow onset events, particularly in your region. I was wondering whether you have filed any kind of lawsuit. I think there is a lawsuit called Juliana versus the United States, where over 20 young people filed against the U.S. for failing to actually take serious actions against the climate. So I was wondering whether you have any kind of experience, like similar experience, or are working on that just to try to make the United States comply with and guarantee the rights of intergenerational equity for young people in the U.S. For Alejandra, I don't know if you are aware that there is currently a request of an advisory opinion before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights regarding the relationship between human rights and climate change. And I was wondering what were your expectations about that particular advisory opinion, and whether you think that advisory opinion could actually impact and prompt states to take climate action more seriously. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for that question. It's a really important question because in the United States, so I've learned the most important way to shift a lot of environmental policy often comes from people suing other people, which is an unfortunate truth in our experience. And though I'm not personally involved in any lawsuits of that kind, I can give two really good examples. One, the lawsuit you're referring to actually just had a really big milestone, and the courts determined that they are going to accept new evidence, meaning that the case can finally move forward. I think it's been 11 years or something crazy. So it's really exciting that they're finally able to move that forward, which is really important. And the second thing is Hawaii, actually the county that I work in on adaptation locally, has one of the furthest stretching lawsuits that has reached our court system, that is going back down to the states now, as a lawsuit against the fossil fuel industry for basically misleading and lying to our community. And hopefully if the city and county of Honolulu does win this lawsuit, then we will be able to acquire new funding to help support our adaptation efforts. And as someone who does locally work on adaptation as well, it's really exciting because we need a lot of money for adaptation, especially on an island. And so the main difference in this case is that we are presenting evidence that they misled and lied to the communities and are only responsible for paying for adaptation, which is a bit different than other lawsuits. And the reason they are telling us anyways, that is why it's being successful. And so yeah, that's my only real experience. Not much, more just on the outskirts.
On the other question, it's great to have another lawyer in the room with this question. I think the advisory opinions, and not only the one in the Inter-American Court, but all the other advisory opinion processes that are being presented in the ICJ and the ITLOS, are very promising. I think that at this point, we need the legal framework, the international legal framework, to more consistently address climate change issues, the climate change emergency, and to further unpack and to clarify which are the obligations of states, specifically in this context, is critical. So, and specifically on the Inter-American process, I am very hopeful because the Inter-American Court seems to be, in general, quite progressive. There is already an advisory opinion on the human rights and environment that has set a very good precedent. The Special Rapporteur on Economic, Social, and Cultural and Environmental Rights also issued a resolution on climate change. So there is a body of standards already at the regional level to build on. The ESCASO agreement for sure as well. So definitely having an advisory opinion that although it is not legally binding for states or for most states, it really provides a pathway to advance on these critical issues, raise ambitions on mitigation, incorporate human rights approaches to adaptation, and furthermore understands the climate emergency as a critical human rights issue, I would say.
Thank you. Any other questions as well for our speaker on online, Tawonga? Yes. Yes. Please go ahead.
Bom dia hoje. Boa tarde, eu sou Daniela, moro em... desculpa. Tá. Oi. Eu sou Daniela Silva, moro no estado do Pará, na Amazônia, no Brasil. E estou gostando muito, minha primeira vez nesse espaço. E acho que a sociedade civil tem muito a ensinar aos governos, às nações. E eu gostei muito da fala da companheira que está online. Ela disse, acho que pensa muito, algo que a gente conversa muito no nosso território, é quem defende os defensores de direitos humanos que estão no território, lutando na linha de frente contra a emergência climática. Eu sou de uma região que assassinaram Dortsteng, Dema, e no Brasil, o Brasil é um dos países mais perigosos para defensores de direitos humanos. Então, se existe uma política de defender os defensores não defendidos. E eu acho que uma outra questão... desculpa, você está...
My name is Daniela. I'm from Pará in the Amazon in Brazil. And first, I would like to say I'm really liking these spaces. I think the civil society has a lot to teach to the governments. And I have a question regarding who is defending, who is in the defense line, the human rights defenders who are in the defense line. I'm in a region where Dortstein was murdered, and we want to know what they are doing about it.
E o como é importante a gente incluir as perspectivas narrativas das juventudes que estão no território. Eu tô na luta climática desde os 13 anos, agora que eu venho me reconhecer como ativista climática. E como empoderar esses jovens que desde criança estão na luta e como também garantir os direitos de crianças e adolescentes que são impactados por grandes empreendimentos. A exemplo de Belo Monte, lá no estado do Pará, eu percebo que pouco se fala do impacto de grandes empreendimentos na vida de crianças que estão sofrendo com a perca da cultura, que estão com adoecimento humano, que estão sofrendo depressão. Então, como é que a gente inclui as crianças nesse espaço? Essa é a minha bandeira hoje na vida. Como inclui as crianças e os jovens? Se a gente fala hoje, a juventude é o futuro, as crianças é o futuro, se a gente nem está garantindo o presente delas. Essa é a minha questão.
I've been a climate activist since I was 13, and just now I'm acknowledging it and recognizing it. So we want to know more and do more about this, and especially about the youth, the children and teenagers who are being impacted, who are getting sick, not only physically sick, but mentally ill. And if we're saying that the youth are the future, how can we say that if we cannot ensure their safety, if we cannot assure their future? So this is something that is really coming into my mind.
E todos os espaços a gente tem falado, a gente precisa incluir as pessoas, mas a linguagem ainda é uma barreira. Como é que a gente inclui as pessoas que estão na linha de frente no território, que não sabem falar inglês, que não sabem falar português? A gente só está aqui a Venatoa, a Açucena, que são do Brasil, a gente só está conseguindo falar, se comunicar, porque a gente tem nossos intérpretes, né? Que é financiado por um programa que, inclusive, tem essa perspectiva inclusiva de pessoas negras, pardas e indígenas da América Latina. Obrigada.
we talk a lot about inclusion, but how can we include people if we cannot even provide language? How can we do? We are here, I'm here with Venatoa, and I'm here with Açucena, and we have language barriers of people who don't speak even Portuguese in Brazil and people who don't speak English. We are here only because we have our own team of interpreters. We brought them, and they are financed through a program directly made for Black, Brown, and Indigenous people from Latin America, and we have our own interpreters. So how can we bridge the gap if we're not even providing the language? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this testimonial. Muchas gracias. La otra lengua a lo mejor que pueda ser útil para hablar. Habíamos anunciado, we announced in the events that we will try to have this kind of translation. Habíamos anunciado tener una traducción al francés, con el francés y el español. But yes, estamos dispuestos a tener el evento más largo y poder hacer la traducción si hace falta y en cualquier momento. cambiaMO y todas las organizaciones que organizan este evento trabajan por una justicia lingüística, también como Women and Gender Constituency, la constituente de mujeres, y estamos intentando llevar a cabo este programa. We will work on language justice, and we regret that we cannot guarantee the simultaneous translation here. But I think that the first question is more related to environmental defender, and maybe I can ask it if briefly, Tawonga, would you like to provide some testimonial from her side, or as well from our side in a previous event? Was one of the great problem was about the right to justice. Uno de los problemas mayores ha sido el derecho a la justicia, a una lawyer, por ejemplo, ¿no? Entonces, I don't know if Tawonga would like to say something before to close this roundtable.
Yes, thank you so much, Maria. From what I understood from her question, she was asking in terms of how environmental defenders who find themselves in these kind of situations, how do they access help? And is there actually any help out there for environmental defenders that are on the front lines of these issues? And the sad reality is that the situation is not isolated to Brazil. I mean, this is happening everywhere and across the globe. Various environmental defenders are facing these different reprisals and are being killed for what it is they're doing and the work it is that they're advancing. And there are various organizations that have really come in to offer that support. We have Natural Justice, we have an emergency fund that offers emergency support for environmental defenders who find themselves in emergency situations within Africa. And there are also other international organizations such as Frontline Defenders, Protection International, various organizations that are able to come in and offer that support. The unfortunate thing is it's also, I guess, it comes down to an issue of access to information, because one thing we've also seen is sometimes environmental human rights defenders don't actually know that they are environmental human rights defenders and that they are fighting for their environment. And they don't understand that they also identify as environmental human rights defenders. So because of lack of information, they're not able to reach out and access the help they need or the information they need so that they can get the help they need. So again, that's an issue that needs to be addressed and looked at, especially for environmental human rights defenders that are in remote areas. And I think that's something that still needs to be discussed and needs to be an ongoing discussion in terms of how do we get that information to environmental human rights defenders who, first of all, do not know that they are defined as environmental human rights defenders, and secondly, who are in remote areas and don't have access to information. So I think those are some of the issues that we need to look at and think about in terms of how we can help environmental human rights defenders who find themselves in these kind of situations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tawonga. Maybe we can, if there are any additional questions, we will move to the second roundtable. And I thank you very much for accompanying us, for your meaningful insights. Yeah, applause. Thank you. And I would like to invite Lien to sit with us. And this second roundtable, we will have one speaker participant here in the room and two more online. Like we said before, Lien Vandamme, I think that most of you know, is a senior campaigner for the Center of International Environmental Law. Lien contributes to CIEL's work on human rights and climate change. She co-facilitates the Human Rights and Climate Change Working Group, convening civil society organizations, indigenous peoples, representatives, and other experts advocating for the promotion and respect of human rights in climate action, and focuses on the UN climate change regime and the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So, Lien, you are really a person, expert, especially advocate, and in this GST process. How can the GST contribute to better integration of human rights in climate action? What could a human rights-based GST outcome look like? Just if we would like to have any imaginary and how it could be. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and also thank you for to all the previous panelists. It was already a very interesting panel. Before I go into how the global stocktake can contribute, maybe I'll just. I think from the previous interventions it's clear, but I just want to take a moment to also, explain why it is important to take a human rights-based approach in climate action. Of course, there are human rights obligations, and all parties to the Paris Agreement have human rights obligations, and they have reaffirmed in the context of the Paris Agreement to respect those human rights obligations when they are implementing the Paris Agreement, so when they are taking climate action. So from that perspective and from the human rights perspective, it is important, but it is also important from a perspective of ambition and effectiveness. Because the IPCC confirms that human rights-based climate action is the most effective climate action. So from the perspective of the ambition, so looking at the global stocktake, which is a process to take stock of collective progress of implementation and then guide us in the way forward. Also from an ambition perspective, this is important. And some examples that are highlighted in the IPCC is that in the context of adaptation, for example, that participatory planning, decision making that involves vulnerable communities in the design and in the implementation leads to more effective policies, to more sustainable adaptation that alleviates social inequities, that ensures climate resilient development, and that avoids maladaptation. Another point that is throughout the IPCC AR6, especially the working group on adaptation report, is also the importance of indigenous people's rights and the integration of indigenous people's rights, but also building on indigenous knowledge in the context of adaptation, and in that context also the importance of secure land rights to ensure effective climate action. So these are some examples of what the IPCC tells about that. So which demonstrates how important it is to take a human rights-based approach to climate action from both the perspective of human rights and from the perspective of ambition. So how can the GST contribute to that? Of course, the GST, as I said, is taking stock of the collective progress in implementing the Paris Agreement and must do so from looking at all angles of the Paris Agreement. And while talking about all angles. I'm not just talking about mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and means of implementation, but also all the social dimensions that are linked to that, and of course the preamble paragraph that states that countries will adhere to their human rights obligations. So we really see the global stocktake as an important moment to look at how countries have been integrating human rights in their climate action, specifically in nationally determined contributions, but also in other national plans and processes that are related to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And that starts, of course, with an inclusive process. And it was already mentioned before by Hailey how important it is to really make sure that all voices are heard in this global stocktake. So this process that we've had and that is concluding here in Bonn, the technical phase, where there have been a lot of discussions on all of these various aspects of the Paris Agreement. We've seen quite an inclusive process, more inclusive than many other things we've seen up until now in the UNFCCC. So that's good. And it also showed, because all the discussions that I've been at, and I think other people can confirm that, where this inclusiveness was happening, the conversations were so different than what we are actually usually seeing in the negotiations in the UNFCCC. We were talking about human rights, we were talking about gender equality, we were talking about indigenous people's rights, and that just shows how important it is to keep that up also now going into the political phase. So we've had those conversations in the technical phase, and now we're moving towards political outcomes. So at the end of the year, at COP28, there's going to be a political outcome, and it's really important that now in the next months, where this technical phase has to be translated into these political outcomes, that also there we keep up this inclusiveness and we make sure that all voices are heard, and that finally we come with a human rights-based outcome of the global stocktake. And so to conclude, what does that mean to have a human rights-based outcome of the global stocktake? Of course, it means a lot of things because it links to all of these topics. But with the Human Rights and Climate Change Working Group, which was already mentioned before, it's a coalition, a very broad coalition of organizations working on human rights and climate change. We've identified 3 key outcomes from a human rights perspective, where the first one is to phase out all fossil fuels and do it urgently and do it equitably, because of course a human rights-based approach to climate action also means that we need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and we can only do that by phasing out all fossil fuels. So that's an important aspect of human rights-based climate action. And then there are 2 other outcomes that are a bit more specific, where we're really looking at the global stocktake to give guidance to parties on how to better integrate human rights in the planning, design, monitoring, implementation, the whole process of their NDCs and other national climate plans. So guidance, but also a commitment of parties to do so that goes beyond a mere repetition of the paragraph that we already have in the Paris Agreement. The paragraph is there, and now we need to move to how are we going to implement this commitment. And then the last one, and I'm not going to go into detail because it was already discussed by Tawonga, but the last one is that we also really look at the global stocktake to ensure enhanced protection for environmental defenders in the context of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So parties really need to take this into account in their NDCs, in other plans, and need to commit through the global stocktake to ensure better protection for environmental defenders. And if I can have 10 more seconds to conclude, I think one point that I think is also very important, and that the global stocktake could also contribute to, but just overall it's very important in the context of the UNFCCC, is that we need to make more synergies with the human rights system, the UN human rights system, but also regional. We were talking about the Inter-American Court, but also national human rights institutions have such an extensive expertise of topics and things that are so relevant in the context of climate action. There's a new general comment by the Committee of the Rights of the Child, for example, on climate. There is an upcoming one of the Committee of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities on disasters, and these kind of general comments and all the outputs of human rights institutions are so relevant to all of the discussions that we are having here in the UNFCCC, and we don't see enough synergies there. So I also call on all of you to, when you're talking about climate, to also look at what exists in the human rights system and vice versa, to make sure that those synergies at least happen at some level, and then hopefully will feed into the UNFCCC at one point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lien. And now I leave the floor to Audrey for presenting to us our second speaker, Elham and Yago. Please, Audrey, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I would like to introduce Elham Youssefian from the International Disability Alliance. Elham is the Humanitarian Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Action Senior Advisor in the International Disability Alliance, or IDA, since 2019. The IDA is the network of 8 global and 6 regional organizations of persons with disabilities advocating for a more inclusive, accessible, and participatory world for everyone. Elham is responsible for leading and coordinating the implementation of IDA's strategy to promote and support inclusion and participation of persons with disabilities and the representative organizations in disaster risk reduction and climate action. Elham is representing persons with disabilities constituency in the UNDRR Stakeholders Engagement Mechanism and co-chairing the Disability Inclusive Working Group of the Global Action on Disability. Elham, I'd like to ask how adoption of pure technical solutions impact rights and inclusion of persons with disabilities. And the second thing is, what do you think adoption of value-based solutions would offer to persons with disabilities? Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here, and I really enjoyed listening to speakers before me, which very much outline how important it is to have a human rights approach to climate action. So I really believe that the global stock-taking process is also an opportunity to advance inclusion and participation of persons with disabilities. As many of you are aware, Paris Agreement also includes obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights of persons with disabilities in climate action. As colleagues mentioned, we do have the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is currently ratified by 186 countries. This means that, like almost universal ratification, this means that nearly all Paris Agreement parties also committed to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights of persons with disabilities. So when we look at the intersection of Paris Agreement and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we find out a number of obligations that governments have towards including persons with disabilities. So I'm kind of answering the second question first by looking into what governments can do and what measures should be taken. And this is going to be also my input for the global stock taking, as this is an opportunity to highlight the gaps that are currently existing in terms of inclusion of persons with disabilities. Persons with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by climate change. This has been recognized by different bodies, including the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, and also the Special Rapporteur on Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change. So the first thing is that governments have to assess and take into account this differential impact. So the first question was, what would be the impact of non-inclusive or climate adaptations that do not consider rights of persons with disabilities? So let me give a couple of examples. When we talk about adaptation, for example, making cities resilient to climate, we had a colleague who was talking from an island. So they're taking measures, for example, to protect houses from sea level rise. But if they do not consider that some persons with disabilities use wheelchair or assistive devices for transportation, they can actually create new barriers adapting to climate change. This means that persons with disabilities should be consulted in climate change adaptation. Another example is the way that, for example, preparation is being organized for heat wave, which is one example of how, for example, persons with disabilities are impacted. In British Columbia, Canada, in the heat wave, we had like 90% of those who lost their life were persons with disabilities and those who have some chronic health conditions. For example, persons with schizophrenia, who, because of the type of the medication that they use, They are most sensitive to heat and can experience health conditions. So not including persons with disabilities in planning adaptation measures can enhance this impact. For example, many people couldn't access cooling centers or couldn't access cooling equipment because of the socioeconomic barriers they face, because of the accessibility barriers that they face in accessing information on how to request this support, where these service provision actually locate. So they cannot find where the place to get assistance is, or they cannot commute to the place, or for example, the cooling center is not accessible so they cannot navigate. They do not access the information because the information is not provided in accessible format. For example, in sign language for those who are deaf, or in audio wave for those who are blind, or in easy to understand for those who have intellectual disabilities. So it is important that governments develop and implement evidence-based inclusive climate adaptation and climate mitigation plans. Together with McGill University, the International Disability Alliance produced a report which was published in COP27 last November, looking into all national determined contributions. We analyzed all of them, and we found out and only 37 out of 192 Paris Agreement members refer in their national determined contributions to persons with disabilities. Only 37. So that means that 81% of governments do not mention disability. And even those who mention usually include some very vague and general reference, just mentioning persons with disabilities among the vulnerable groups. We also look at the national adaptation policies, and we found out that 46 parties to the Paris Agreement currently refer to people with disabilities in some way in their climate adaptation policies. This means that 76% of the states do not mention persons with disabilities in national adaptation. These numbers can speak for themselves, that despite their obligations under the CRPD, despite their obligations under Paris Agreement, this huge number of governments even do not make a single reference to persons with disabilities. So I leave you with this, and I really hope that everyone in the room and online can take measures at national and international levels to address the systematic exclusion and ignorance and negligence to persons with disabilities in climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elham. And Audrey, please, I leave the floor for introducing the last speaker. That is a little bit different approach. And yes, the floor is yours, Audrey.
Thank you, Elham and Lien, so far. It's been really interesting. It's my pleasure to introduce Yago Bermejo. Yago has a degree in physics. He has previously worked in teaching and on projects in the cultural and technological fields. For the last 12 years, he has focused exclusively on citizen democracy projects, starting his career in this field in 2012, working on hybrid digital participation projects in social movements and political parties. From 2015 to 2019, he was directing a democratic innovation lab at the Madrid City Council in coordination with the Open Government Area and the Decide Madrid platform. During those years, he was part of the design team in coordination of the G1000 Madrid and the City Observatory. In 2019, he founded Deliberativa together with Arantxa Mendihara. Thank you for giving me grace during pronunciation. In these years, they helped to design and implement multiple local and regional projects. He has special interest in transnational deliberation, and he has been heavily involved as part of the core design and coordination team in the Future of Europe Conference, The Next Generation. Yago, thanks for being here today. I'd like to ask two questions. One, what are the risks of advancing the climate agenda without taking into account people in all their diversity? And two, how shifting the focus from technical solutions to values-based resolutions in climate assemblies can benefit in climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Audrey. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I will give you two perspectives that are completely different. On the one hand, I will give you the perspective of the global north, diversity of people, and on the other hand, I will give you the global south perspective. And this will be linked with two of the projects that I have been involved, as you were saying, the Conference on the Future of Europe, that is Europe, Global North Deliberation, and the Global Assembly that you didn't mention, but it's a project that includes the whole globality of participants from all over the world. So from the global north perspective, what is the risk? So eventually the climate agenda will reach the political arena. So eventually it will reach the lives of citizens. This is already happening in many places. So the big risk here is that people feel that the effort they have to make to change their behavior or their way of life to accommodate these policies is not fair. And why this can happen? I mean, people could say, why do I need to make this effort? I mean, remember that global north people is people that is usually consuming a lot of resources. So why I'm the one who has these difficulties and these problems? Why not those other? Why not those other countries? Why not those other rich people that I see on TV? So this is the kind of question that people will be asking in the global north. So people in general are adapted to their lives. We need to remember this and have an agenda to thrive. And climate change adaptation and mitigation may interfere with their lives strongly, and it requires a structural change in society. So there will be two main possible things that are happening already. So protests and social mobilizations, like for example, the Yellow Jackets movement against the taxes to diesel fuels, or the growth of parties that are less ambitious about the pace of the climate agenda, or worse, the rise of the nihilist parties, of the nihilist leaders like Donald Trump, for example. So how people can face these efforts with the necessary motivation and commitment. We believe that people will only be able to do so if they are the ones who strike the necessary balance between the consequences of climate inaction and the effort they have to make to change their lives. So this is why we believe it's essential to use climate citizen assemblies to address the main policy dilemmas on the climate agenda. Because this is not the main topic on this call, I will remember that the Climate Assembly brings a mini public of people all together representing more or less one population. So it uses several criteria to match the population. So in some way it represents society, but taking into account all the different educational and socioeconomic levels. So what happened with the Global South perspective? So what do you think all these countries and citizens with low levels of responsibility for climate change and low levels of consumption will tolerate this slowness and lack of responsibility of countries in the global north, while bearing to this burden and impacts that having fewer resources to deal with them on adaptation, for example, policies? So I'm going to say something a little bit exaggerated maybe, but I do not rule out a revelation by the Global South against the West backed by undemocratic superpowers. I think this is on the agenda right now with this situation. So the positive side of this, the alternative. So citizen assemblies are a mini public, a mini country, a mini city, so they are a cross-section of the population, as I was saying. So an assembly is the best proxy to talk to society that we have nowadays. Climate assembly, on the same hand, climate assembly is not a silver bullet, so we cannot ask for magical solution for technical questions to citizens, but it's nice to ask value-based questions to them. I mean, everyday citizens can respond to value-based questions quite nicely. So they could be asking questions like, how far do you think it is fair to make an effort? To what extent are these efforts distributed in society, for example, to change society, to change economy, to change jobs, to change transportation, all these things. Perhaps this balanced solution is not the most ambitious in the global north, but if the outcome of the deliberation is translated into decision-making and public opinion, it will be a vaccine for reactionary policies. Let us remember that reactionary politics could block the climate agenda for some years to come. So social agreed solutions about such setbacks and are, in our view, a way to maximize the cruising speed of the climate agenda. On the Global South perspective, So we believe that exporting the citizen assembly on a global scale can help efforts to be distributed in a better way. Keep in mind that 70% of the assembly, of this kind of global assembly, would be people who don't own a car, don't travel by plane, don't move beyond their village. They don't have high level of consumption. So what will be their decision in terms of balancing the distribution of efforts globally? So I think that will be the global south perspective to find a solution in this direction. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yago. Actually, we are working with Yago for creating guidelines on with the inclusive anti-patriarchal facilitation for really have this democratical arena of decision about climate change and adaptation solution in a more inclusive way. So this is what we are doing in Klima's project. Thank you very much. We have not so much time, but there is cambiaMO. I would like to leave it to the audience, the space for some questions as well for the second roundtable, if the technical persons allowed me. So, any questions, please, for in room and online presenters. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you. I have a question for the second speaker. I didn't get his name, sorry.
Elham.
Elham, yeah.
Okay.
Elham, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the role of public opinion, and you mentioned that, and how this could be like a tool for political action in terms of climate change and human rights. Thank you.
Elham, did you have the opportunity?
It's for me.
Yes,
Is it for me?
Yes, it's
political opinion. I don't think I did mention anything about political opinion, though. I did speak about persons with disabilities.
Yeah, maybe it's so for Yago or Yago. Okay, Yago, it was for you. So could you please, yes, yes. Did you listen the question, Yago?
Yes, but
okay.
Can you repeat it, please?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the role of public opinion, because you mentioned that as like a way to achieve some changes and tackle climate action.
Yeah. So usually when we work in a city assembly, we call it mini public. And then we have the maxi public, which is public opinion, I would say. No? So working in a deliberative citizen assembly with allow us is to assess which are the trade-offs that everyday citizen need to make to find a balance in this kind of transformation moment that we are living, or transformation of the economy, transformation of all the economic system. So this kind of information is not only a recommendation for public policy, but it's also information about how we can inform public opinion in general, because we know that this line of thought, this line of learning and thought, and maybe campaigning, etc., will be fitting what they need to hear to understand the trade-offs that they need to make in their everyday lives. So this is a way. Obviously, this is a challenge. The connection with the mini public and the maxi public is not really settled yet. How to do it in a smart way, I would say, but there are several perspectives to do so, and I believe that will be the first stage. So having the mini public outcome to go then to the maxi public and create and try to change the public opinion on one, for example, one political dilemma related with change in transportation, for example. I hope it makes sense.
Yeah. And then if you are more interested on that, we can share with you as well the website and the link to Klima's project that will be working for creating a fair, inclusive, anti-patriarchal setup for the climate assemblies, and you can find more information. So thank you very much. If there, please go ahead, Alejandra. You deserve. Need the micro. You can even, okay, no, there is the micro. Otherwise, people online cannot hear you.
Thank you. I'll just make a very simple question. What do you see as key challenges to go from the what we need to do to the how we do it? How do we achieve these outcomes on the global stocktake? And that would be a first part of the question. And what efforts can we perhaps advance in order to also contribute to its implementation? A few thoughts on that respect.
I think in terms of, challenges, it's clear that the guidance exists to take a human rights-based approach to many things and also to climate action. So we know how to do it. As I said, there's all these human rights institutions that have developed all these, frequently asked questions documents, toolkits. And so I would say that the main challenge at the level of the UNFCCC and its implementation is political will to do so. So, and it's also very difficult to talk about human rights often in these spaces because there are some parties that really just don't want to speak about it and don't want to mention it in any outcomes. And so what we see is a constant reverting back to this paragraph in the preamble. And I think Floridea can also speak to what happened at ACE last year. So it's really, we stick to this, like very general commitment. And then when it comes to implementation, there's a lot of pushback. So I would say political will. And then your second question was, what can we do? Or maybe I'll hand it to Floridea for that one. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, I think that we, as well there, we need to find a kind of a common baseline. This side events was framed like value-based and human rights. Maybe we need to be, even in the language, more inclusive. And maybe if human rights makes is not so comfortable language for some parties, it's important to keep the substance of the things. So the rights to communication, to the information, to the participation, to the democracy, to the training in climate change. We observe a kind of needs of climate literacy. This was one of the results as well of the IPCC of this year, and we are glad that the IPCC was highlighted this aspect. We would like as well that maybe the IPCC we see that they are in the line of research action, and really we need to go to that. We need to bring the knowledge for creating the arguments for in the political part. Like Lien was saying before, we are in the technical dialogue in the GST. Now we are preparing the political part. We need to bring this. We need to challenge these two aspects, and this is like climate change is a boat. We are all on this boat, or we are all on the ocean. There is not a medium terms. So I will try to recap with an expression from a colleague. She's a party actually, representing party, and she said that there is maybe not global north, global south. The planet is round, so we are all of there. And but of course there is a very needs of advocacy on that more than research. We know a lot already, and we need to engage in the process in an inclusive, gender responsive, transformative way, respectful of the ancestral knowledge, and and this is always what we said at the end of the side events. But still we need to put a lot of effort. Thank you very much for your participation, and
your great patience, as well with my low technological skills that were very clear here. But I think that all of us have some weakness, and we need to deal with more with our weakness than with our strength. Thank you very much.